This film has been made by Go Gentle Australia with support from the Clem Jones Group and the Vasudhara Foundation. Hello, I'm Andrew Denton, the founding director of Go Gentle Australia. I'd like to be upfront about where I stand. Together with the other makers of this film, I support compassionate end-of-life choices for the terminally ill. This includes the legalisation of voluntary assisted dying. We also encourage a rational and factual discussion around this complex issue. Unfortunately, that's not always what we get.
Now to the tragic story of a 17-year-old girl who's understood to have ended her life with euthanasia in the Netherlands. Noah Pothoven.
June 2019. The world's media reports that Dutch teenager Noah Pothoven has been legally euthanized. Noah had been sexually abused as a child and had never recovered from the trauma. The story is shocking, the coverage dramatic.
A sexual abuse victim in the Netherlands has been allowed to have doctor-assisted suicide.
A 17-year-old Dutch girl reportedly used euthanasia to end her life. So why do you think that they allow this?
I don't know.
Noah decided to end her life. This is with the help of a euthanasia clinic.
How does that work?
That doesn't sit easily with me.
No,
It doesn't sit well.
The news spreads around the world as it's shared in hundreds of thousands of social media posts. Groups opposed to voluntary assisted dying are quick to jump on the story. Even Pope Francis joins the outraged conversation, calling euthanasia a defeat for all. But there was just one problem. The story was wrong.
Did the BBC do enough to correct a viral fake news story? Or should they have waited until they could have established the full facts?
The truth was, Noah's request to be legally euthanized had been refused by Dutch doctors. She had passed away after choosing to not take food and water. And the lesson from this sad event? When it comes to voluntary assisted dying and euthanasia, you need to check the source of the claims you've been given. This is a film about life and death, and the importance of getting the story right.
They just killed my mother.
Do you think that's good thing for a doctor or bad?
Bad.
Yeah.
This is a film about truth and deception.
We know that it's coming, and it could unleash a tsunami of death.
This is a film about a film. How we deal with death and the choices we make at the end of life are understandably emotional issues. But when we ask policymakers to make laws on our behalf, it seems only right that they base their decisions on evidence and tested facts. Our research shows that there are serious efforts being made by some who oppose voluntary assisted dying laws to hijack the public conversation with misleading information, and that can have serious consequences.
My name is Ben White. I'm a professor in the Australian Centre for Health Law Research in the Faculty of Law at QUT. My work almost exclusively focuses on end-of-life law, policy and practice. I've been researching in the field for about 18 years. I'm not here today to talk about the rights and wrongs of voluntary assisted dying, but I do want to state my position just so I can be transparent. And that is that it's possible to have a safe and effective voluntary assisted dying system that gives choice, allows autonomy for terminally ill patients who are suffering. And that system can also robustly protect the vulnerable. So that's my position, but as I said, my goal here today is to talk about why evidence matters when we're making laws. Voluntary assisted dying is a critical social issue. Both sides of the argument have a duty and responsibility to be transparent in their views and also clear about the evidence that they're relying on. This isn't about the rights and wrongs of voluntary assisted dying. This is making sure we have good, strong, evidence-based lawmaking and policy.
One film aiming to influence our lawmaking is a Canadian production called Fatal Flaws.
I've traveled across oceans and continents to see if this debate is really about compassion.
Released in 2018, it presents as a documentary about euthanasia and voluntary assisted dying.
Is it really about freedom? About dignity? Is everything we've heard about euthanasia dead wrong?
But looked at more closely, This is not a documentary. It's something very different.
If you replace the needle or the pill with the gun, that would make a much more vivid picture.
Well, it's a murder on request. It's a suicide with help.
A doctor might try to talk you into killing yourself.
This is not a documentary, this is a propaganda film.
We've asked experts in law, media and marketing to look at the film, to reveal the ways it deliberately manipulates the evidence and skews the debate.
When you watch Fatal Flaws, you're not watching something that has any intention of telling you a factual, evidence-based perspective.
This is not a film that even comes close to meeting basic journalistic standards.
What you're seeing in this film is a whole bunch of emotional scare tactics.
And we've looked closely at what the makers of Fatal Flaws don't want you to see. The web of undeclared religious, financial and political links behind the film that raises questions about its real agenda.
Well, who is this man who's fronting it?
Who is behind this documentary? Who funded it? Who stands to benefit from it?
Fatal Flaws is directed by Canadian Kevin Dunn, who presents himself as a man on a quest for knowledge.
Most people come to Amsterdam for a holiday. I'm here for Euthanasia Week.
His film has been shown around the world. Mr. Dunn claims it's been responsible for preventing laws being changed. He's touring the film in Australia ahead of a vote to legalise voluntary assisted dying in the West Australian Parliament. Others appearing in the film have also come to Australia to lobby our politicians.
Fatal Flaws has a particular aim, which is preventing voluntary assisted dying from occurring in Australia.
I think it's targeting people who kind of, those few people who are sitting on the fence thinking, yeah, I do support voluntary assisted dying, but there may be issues with that.
The movie is effective in that it's very emotional and it's emotionally charged.
I want to give you a big hug.
There are moments that, you know, I came close to, maybe not tearing up, but close to it.
It's undoubtedly a powerful film, cleverly designed to confuse and mislead. To do this, it uses a number of techniques. Fatal Flaws relies heavily on the testimony of people who believe they've been failed by death with dignity laws. Using these emotional stories is not incidental. It's the core approach of the film.
In fact, they just killed my mother.
It's my mom. Don't take her away.
My name's Sharona Coots and I'm a solicitor, and for the best part of 2 decades I worked as an investigative reporter, mostly in the United States. Any professional storyteller knows that one of the most important elements of connecting with your audience is through people and through people's stories.
Adam Ferrier, consumer psychologist. I apply psychology and behavioural economics to decision making. All the information and rational arguments in the world won't change somebody's behaviour, but a good story or a good image can be much more powerful.
She's going to die. Next patient.
You see a whole lot of different emotional stories that kind of just draw us in. And as it draws us in, we tend to start to believe the messaging because it's appealing to our emotions.
I'm Simon Chapman. I'm Emeritus Professor of Public Health at the University of Sydney, specialising in interest groups and lobby groups, tobacco control area, gun control area, anti-immunisation groups. The dominant framing in Fatal Flaws is to say that if you go ahead with voluntary assisted dying legislation, there will be, sooner than later, a lot of people who will be killed against their will. Scenarios were painted of predatory doctors who tried to, like salesmen, talk these people into ending their lives.
There was a meeting with my mom to which I was not invited, and my mom told me that they had discussed end of life. We managed to stop that doctor. She just improved after that.
When somebody wanted to give up on you, you didn't give up.
My name is Sophia Resnick. I've been a journalist for the past 10 plus years, focusing on the religious right in America. There's a story about a mother and her child. You know, her whole life she's had cerebral palsy and spina bifida, and the mother talks about how there was a doctor who pulled her aside.
And he took me out in the hallway and he just stood me up against the wall and he told me about assisted suicide death was legal in Canada. And I said, well, he asked, did I know? And I said, no. And then he said, he was all for it. And I said, well, that was your choice. And I told him I wasn't interested in anything to do with assisted suicide death. And he told me, he said, I was being selfish.
I think that as a filmmaker, when you're telling a story like that, I would want to know what that situation actually looked like from a different perspective. It didn't appear to me that anyone was forced to do anything, that it was just something that came up. It's painted in this story and in other stories throughout the documentary when people are just asked the question if they were interested. They turn it around and say, they were trying to talk me into it, I felt forced.
None of the people filmed by Dunn are available to Australian politicians to see if there's more to their story. We never hear an alternative view, and that's a deliberate tactic.
There's a concept called all you see is all there is. So if you're presented with a particular argument, if it's an emotional connecting argument and follows all those kind of patterns like you've just seen in here, we tend to go along with it. The brain doesn't automatically think, oh, I wonder what all the counter arguments are, or I wonder what this is missing out on. We tend to just appraise the information that's in front of us.
When you want to delay or prevent change, the most effective method is to scare people.
Because that scares me. That phrase scares the hell out of me.
I'm very afraid.
Because I was afraid. My life hung in the balance.
The filmmaker used the word scare multiple times throughout the film, and I think that was intended to be the subliminal message that these laws are frightening.
It started with the terminally ill, but in some places, if you're old or disabled or depressed, a doctor might try to talk you into killing yourself.
Information that's presented negatively or appeals to fear is kind of processed more deeply, and we respond more urgently to than positive emotions. So what this film has going for it is its appeal to fear and what could go wrong, and that's much more powerful than hope and positivity.
One way of striking fear and doubt in people's minds is to suggest that once things get started, they can never be stopped.
Lawmakers and advocates have accelerated the expansion of these laws. They're even talking about euthanasia for children.
It's called the slippery slope argument, and it's a repeated technique used in Fatal Flaws.
Robert Jonquière is executive director of the World Federation of Right to Die Societies. He admits that the reason people are choosing to die is changing.
We have developed the last 15 years a situation where it became more and more clear that it was not about terminal illness, but it was termination of suffering, and you can suffer of many things.
But doesn't that scare you? Doesn't it like to me it scares me. It scares me to think that it's going to keep on moving and moving and moving.
I don't believe it.
The slippery slope Dr. Jonquière is talking about might not scare him, but the way the regulations keep expanding terrifies me.
Numerous parliamentary and judicial inquiries have investigated and rejected the slippery slope argument in relation to assisted dying laws, but opponents of change continue to use it. We've seen it before in Australia, most recently in the debate on same-sex marriage.
I'm Charlene Robinson and I'm a historian, and I was involved in the campaign for marriage equality in Australia. We would often hear people talking about these other unforeseen consequences that would happen if the law was changed.
Changing the meaning of marriage has unintended consequences.
Ludicrous things sometimes. People would be able to marry the Harbour Bridge, that sort of thing. We're way past the anniversary of marriage equality. People aren't marrying their fridges. So it was a way of trying to make sure that people are talking about other things rather than what was a very simple and popularly supported reform.
You know, the strategy of the slippery slope is a time-honoured strategy for people who don't want change to be introduced. We saw very similar things with the tobacco industry when we proposed that tobacco advertising be banned on radio and television in the 1970s. They shot back, oh, well, what's next? It's going to be chocolate, it's going to be alcohol, it's going to be pharmaceuticals, it's going to be hamburgers. All of those things, 40 years later, are still, of course, all out there.
While fear and appeals to emotion are Fatal Flaws' most effective tools, they're not the only ones used in this film. Framing is another, giving you only a part of the story in the hope of planting a seed of doubt in your mind.
This is Portland, Oregon, the very first U.S. state to legalize assisted suicide back in 1997.
When I visited Death with Dignity, the organization was recognizing 20 years of the laws passing in Oregon.
Dunn uses framing when he visits Oregon, making a claim which on the surface seems disturbing, but which, when looked at more closely, turns out not to be the full story.
One of the underlying conditions was diabetes. And to me, that kind of jumped out of the page to me. It said, some with diabetes access this law?
Under Oregon law, only the terminally ill with less than 6 months to live qualify for assistance to die.
If conditions like diabetes are qualifying under the law, where are the stringent safeguards protecting the system from abuse?
It sounds like a reasonable question, but in raising it, Dunn leaves out a crucial piece of information.
What they didn't say is, of course, that end-stage diabetes can be really quite a horrible existence. You know, people will have their feet, hands sometimes amputated, they sometimes go blind, they sometimes have unremitting neuropathic pain, nothing can be done about it. We've all got friends, relatives who have got diabetes. They're having quite good quality of life. Those are not the people who would be seeking voluntary assisted dying for their diabetes. It would be people with end-stage diabetes, and this film dishonestly did not elaborate on that.
Continuing to play on our fears, Dunn uses framing once again when talking with Oregon doctor Charles Bentz.
Dr. Charles Bentz says there's less oversight for taking a patient's life than there is for taking out their tonsils.
I'm protected completely from civil or criminal liability, and I don't even have to fill out any paperwork.
Well, this is absolute nonsense. I mean, tonsillectomy is a very, very common, fairly minor operation. Voluntary assisted dying is something which has a huge amount of oversight in every country which has introduced it, and with big penalties applying to people who breach it.
The exaggeration about tonsils is no trivial slip of the tongue. Dr. Bentz certainly understands the power of language.
Language is a critical factor here. And as I think a famous person once said, all social engineering is preceded by verbal engineering.
Search for the source of that quote, and it turns out to be a talking point repeated by Dr. Bentz's fellow travellers in the Right to Life movement. And we are never told that this same echo chamber is funding and stage managing Fatal Flaws. So who is behind this film? And who is Kevin Dunn?
My name is Kevin Dunn. I worked in media most of my life.
I was watching it and I was thinking, well, who is this man who's fronting it? And I was asking myself, well, does he represent any particular interest group? Any ideological or religious interest group? Is this affiliated with a group of other committed Christians for whom voluntary assisted dying is dogmatically wrong, and they want everybody to follow their dogma on this issue?
Kevin Dunn presents himself as on a quest for knowledge, a quest to expose hidden truths. He sort of talks in these terms as if there's another side to the story around assisted dying laws that hasn't been told. But there's an untold story about himself in the film, which is that he comes from a very religious, very traditional Catholic background.
I said to the Lord, I said, Lord, I want to do more. And a few people had talked to me about, could you do more for pro-life? And I thought, you know what, I'll do this. So that's where the impetus came.
There's nothing wrong with people adhering to the Catholic faith and living those values. But for those Catholics who have a very, very traditional interpretation of doctrine, it's a very particular worldview, and it's not one that's shared with the general public. And I think for that reason, it's important to disclose that so that viewers understand where you're coming from.
During the film, Kevin Dunn introduces us to several medical doctors, each with their own anecdotes of assisted dying gone wrong.
The purpose of using experts is to give authority to a particular point of view, to try to at least present information as if it's objective. That's why we trust experts.
all the doctors who are kind of the pillars of society they interview, you think, oh, I had lots of doctors, lots of MDs in there as well. So therefore, what they're saying must be accurate or must be true.
What is not declared is that some of the doctors presented in the film are linked together through the same anti-assisted dying lobby.
She said, why aren't you giving me the pills? I want the pills.
Kenneth Stevens is a former missionary and also Vice President of the Physicians for Compassionate Care Education Foundation.
I think one of the biggest mistakes that we can make is using the terms death with dignity, aid in dying, or any of those other euphemisms.
Charles Bence works for one of the largest Catholic healthcare organisations in North America and is president of the foundation.
Well, if taking a massive overdose to kill yourself is dignified, then what does it say for the majority of people who die naturally, like my wife did?
And a leading member of the Catholic Medical Association, William Toffler, is National Director of the Compassionate Care Group.
When I looked up Dr. Toffler online, I immediately saw a page that is related to the Catholic Church. And on that page, he says that one of his areas of expertise is the potential link between abortion and breast cancer. That's a supposed link that is in fact a lie. It's not a point of view, it's been debunked. It doesn't meet medical or scientific evidence standards. That immediately, to my mind, destroyed any shred of credibility that he would have as an expert.
In fact, most of the apparently independent experts appearing in the film are connected through organisations dedicated to preventing end-of-life law reforms, and they share strong religious views.
Another one of the people who appeared in the film is Alex Schardenberg, who's the head of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition.
They're selling assisted suicide as a form of freedom.
The Euthanasia Prevention Coalition is a Canadian group that helped fund the film, a fact which was also not disclosed during the film when that organisation was discussed and other representatives from the organisation were interviewed as if they were objective. That coalition is also funded by the Catholic Church.
My friend Alex Schardenberg from Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, him and I were talking at the time. I wanted to do a film, he wanted to do a film, and then he said, well, we'll give you some money to help you do this film. And so we collaborated on it.
He is the executive producer of the movie and doesn't disclose that that's the case. You only find out if you sit and watch through the whole credits. And how many people, if they're just watching a movie, are going to sit and absorb all of the credits and realize that some of the experts in the movie were actually producing it?
Dunn and Schadenberg adhere to the Vatican's traditional doctrine on how to treat the end of life.
Pain in the final moments of life can take on spiritual significance for the sick person and can be accepted as union with the redemptive sacrifice of Christ.
Alex used to work for the Knights of Columbus. And the Knights of Columbus, if you're unfamiliar, it's a Catholic men's organization. It's a fraternal organization.
We must be serious about stopping America's #1 cause of death.
Actually, the organization has gotten to some hot water a few years ago because it turned out that while they were supposed to be funding impoverished communities and doing charities that, help the public good, they were instead funneling millions of dollars into anti-LGBT rights and anti-abortion political issues.
The Knights of Columbus operates a $2 billion insurance and investment business. It's a major contributor to anti-euthanasia causes, and it helps fund another contributor to Fatal Flaws, Catherine Glenn Foster.
It could unleash a tsunami of death.
Miss Glenn Foster is a committed Right to Life campaigner whose mission in life is clear.
It really was a calling from God. I'm here because God put a calling on my life.
Well, one of the people that have appeared in the film that immediately caught my attention was Catherine Glenn Foster. Right down at the bottom in white, she was identified as having an affiliation with Americans United for Life. Normally as a journalist, what you would do is explain her position there and explain what that organisation is because it's really, really important and influential in this whole debate. Americans United for Life, over a decade, they have managed to pass laws that have had the sum effect of dramatically winding back access to reproductive services in the United States.
We never become stronger as women when we abort our own children.
And their biggest donors are evangelical political organisations, along with the Knights of Columbus, that pursue a very conservative Catholic agenda.
We are never told of the links between the contributors. They are not independent commentators. They share political, financial, and above all, religious allegiances. We've been able to identify that at least 14 of the contributors to the film have strongly expressed religious or right-to-life affiliations.
You realize that religion is the thing that's threading all of these people in this film together. Of course, there is not a problem with being religious, but I think that religion isn't once mentioned in this film, that the Catholic Church is never mentioned in this film. The Catholic Church has a lot of stake in these particular policies and are essentially driving a lot of political opposition. It's a gross omission to not even mention it, to pretend that this is a purely secular film when it clearly isn't.
I just think it's very important for Australians to understand what this is, what's behind it, and the motives and the modus operandi of the groups and people who are producing it.
Fatal Flaws' use of fear, emotional manipulation, and deliberate framing all come together with the film's allegation that hundreds of patients in Belgium are being euthanized without their consent.
In Belgium, euthanasia has been legal since 2002. In 2013, over 1,000 euthanasias were performed without patient consent, and the situation has only gotten worse.
It's a dramatic accusation.
If that's how far things have gone in Europe, what does the future hold for jurisdictions that are now considering euthanasia laws?
Such a significant claim should require further explanation, but the film doesn't offer it.
That's a striking figure, and I find it interesting that they bothered to shoot a street in Brussels, but they have not talked to anyone involved in any of these so-called deaths without consent, and I want to know more because that's a huge figure that they just glossed over to say that this is what will happen in other countries.
Kevin Dunn is referring to what is known as non-voluntary euthanasia. It does happen and has done for many years, not just in Belgium, but in every country around the world that's been studied, including Australia. The film wants you to think that these kinds of deaths are the sinister result of Belgium's euthanasia laws, but the official record shows the truth is actually the opposite. The quoted research clearly shows that the rates of these kind of deaths have significantly declined in that country since their laws were enacted. Dunn and Schadenberg have previous form on this claim from an earlier film.
Should we not be concerned that in Belgium, where they've legalized euthanasia, that you have over 1,000 deaths in 2013 alone in that Flanders region, which are hastened without request?
It's also a claim I heard directly from Alex Schadenberg when I met him in Australia in 2015. When I asked him if he was alleging that these deaths without consent were acts of murder, he didn't hesitate. So is it your assertion that those 1,000 deaths, or the majority of them, were in effect a murder because they were not deaths that anyone had consented to?
Murder, manslaughter, it depends on how you define it in the law. Yes, they are.
Alex was at pains to point out that his allegations were based on original studies done by Belgian and Dutch researchers. I took his claims seriously and bought his book, Exposing Vulnerable People to Euthanasia and Assisted Suicide, so I could more closely examine them. The first thing I noticed is that the foreword to the book was written by federal MP Kevin Andrews and endorsed by a number of politicians around Australia. One of these was Western Australian MP Nick Goiran, who in early 2019 flew to New Mexico to speak at Schadenberg's Euthanasia Prevention Coalition conference. To better understand Schadenberg's claims, I enlisted the help of the Dean of Tasmania's Law School, Professor Margaret Odlowski.
It's dangerous for Schadenberg to use that data to make the sorts of claims that he is, because one of the really clear and strong messages is that there isn't an increase in unrequested killing. If anything, that is reducing. And that, to me, is one of the clearest things that is coming through the recent empirical data. It's just staggering that he can come to a completely opposite conclusion from that body of research.
These claims continue to be repeated. Most recently in 2019, in videos made by the Catholic Church in Australia and released on the personal Facebook page of the Archbishop of Sydney, Anthony Fisher. We spoke to the researcher whose work these claims are based on. He calls the video an appalling misrepresentation of his research.
In their video, they say, if you allow euthanasia legally, then you can expect active hastening of death without explicit request as well. And this is a very frequently quoted argument in the slippery slope debate around the legalization of euthanasia. But this is the exact opposite conclusion that we have drawn. And we know it happened before the euthanasia law, and the rate went down after the euthanasia law was enacted. And again, the fact that it happens in other countries without the assisted dying law means that it's not something that automatically follows from a euthanasia law, not in the slightest.
Professor Chambert wrote to the Archbishop, objecting strongly to the misuse of his research in the Church's video. The Archbishop's office simply doubled down and refused to withdraw.
Even when you set the record straight clearly, as I've done in my response, they just ignore it and they repeat the same message.
Deceptions will always travel further than the truth. One of those interviewed in the film, and someone who helped fund it, is Nancy Elliott.
And I try to help, people that are in other countries.
She too is linked to other contributors through the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. In 2015, Miss Elliott spoke at the same anti-euthanasia symposium in Adelaide where I met Alex Schadenberg. In friendly company, she felt comfortable revealing the techniques used to influence politicians.
You have lots of arguments. If one argument gets blown out of the water, you still have more. And each argument will reach somebody else. Right now, the disability argument is really kicking it. It's very powerful. Now, will it always be powerful? We don't know. When one of our arguments dies, we need to be ready to pick up another one. You only have to convince legislators that they don't want this bill. You don't have to win their hearts and minds. All you have to do is get them to say, not this bill.
A film like this is best seen as a piece of messaging. It's really a piece of propaganda intended to have an effect on the people who see it, which is why I think it's very interesting to learn that it is being circulated to politicians in Australia. But it is only the result of strategies that are put in place by a very large behind-the-scenes operation.
The people behind Fatal Flaws are not interested in a real discussion about voluntary assisted dying. There's no attempt throughout the film to honestly argue the pros and cons of the issue. They hide their associations, they hide their real agendas, they hide themselves. And every effort is made to avoid the central fact that the core of these laws is that they're voluntary. They're your choice. By carefully framing the information you're being given and setting it all to a drumbeat of fear, they're seeking to sow a seed of doubt in your mind in the hope that it might grow into a harvest of hesitation. But we can't make good laws based on manipulation and fear campaigns. We need to rely on credible evidence.
Voluntary assisted dying is a critical social issue. Optimal lawmaking, our best lawmaking that we can do, happens when people are very, very clear about the morals and values that underpin the arguments that are being put forward, and we rely on the best and most credible and reliable evidence that's available. If we do that, we get high quality law based on transparent, evidence-based thinking. There's also been two major parliamentary committee reports in Australia, one in Victoria and more recently in Western Australia. Both reports are available online and go through in some detail the evidence about voluntary assisted dying both here and overseas, and there's a reliable, trustworthy source of information on this.
If you'd like to know more about the film Fatal Flaws or to hear extended interviews with our expert analysts or Professor Ben White, go to our website, gogentleaustralia.org.au. Thanks for taking the time to watch this film. I wish you well in making up your own mind about our end-of-life choices.